On this President's Day, this president is celebrating an anniversary of his own. But taxpayers have nothing to celebrate. Welcome, everybody. I'm Charles Payne in for Neil Cavuto. 5 years ago today, the president signed an $800 billion stimulus bill into law. And remember when he said this about it.
Today does mark the beginning of the end, the beginning of what we need to do to create jobs, the beginning of the first steps to set our economy on a firmer foundation.
Well, that foundation still isn't looking so firm, Mr. President. According to the Bureau of Labor Statistics, 10 million people are unemployed. But even worse, an additional 91 million are out of work and not even looking. They've just given up. Washington Watch's Sabrina Schaefer and former Office Depot CEO Steve Odland says it wasn't worth the money. Sabrina.
Well, this is a perfect, the president took a page from the WPA and FDR just years and years ago. We haven't done anything new except for the president is now trying to defend the creation of government-created jobs rather than saying we don't know what would have happened had the government stayed out of the business of job creation and allowed the economy to move forward and the private sector to create jobs in a more efficient manner.
Although, Steve, you can't argue coming from, the private side, we do know when government gets as large as this government is, it does crowd out the private sector, mitigating what they can do for the economy.
Yeah, Charles, I think if you look at the situation 5 years ago, there was bipartisan panic over the state of the jobs. They wanted to rush as much money into the economy as possible with shovel-ready investments, right? Remember, that was the term, shovel-ready investments. Well, here we are today, and if we had the same labor participation rate today of 66% that we had back then, the equivalent unemployment rate today would be 11%. So we have not moved the needle here. And I think that there are two lessons learned. One, an investment has to have return. Without return, all you're doing is you're simply putting transfer payments out there or you're getting into crony capitalism. The second thing is that in order to have lasting return, you can't do these temporary programs. You've got to give businesses long-term tax policy reform, long-term entitlement reform, and businesses need to be able to plan over a multi-year period. So these temporary programs don't work.
Sabrina?
And yeah, the big problem here, right, is exactly that these are temporary, unsustainable jobs, and it's an inefficient use of taxpayer dollars, right? So we had the president and the White House sort of picking winners and losers and determining how best to create jobs. So if you were in 2009 when the TARP bill went through, if you were a green home energy owner, you were a winner. If you were a regular homeowner, you were a loser. If you were big ag, you were a winner. If you were a small farmer, you were a loser. But we know that this is just like throwing spaghetti at the wall and seeing what sticks rather than allowing businesses to know where best to put its resources.
And Steve, along that line, not only has the administration picked winners, but de facto they've picked the losers as well. Okay, we want solar and wind to succeed, therefore we want coal not to succeed. And that's had a real debilitating impact on our economy, hasn't it?
Well, I think it has. This was supposed to be a green energy bill, and it was supposed to be an infrastructure bill, but only 6% of the stimulus spending was spent on infrastructure. And that would have been a great investment because you would have a long-term, decades-long return, and a very small percentage, maybe a couple percent, was spent on truly green energy. Much of it just went to subsidize state and local government workers' jobs. So all of this was temporary. We need to get back to a long-term government policy that businesses can plan on.
Sabrina, what if, right now you have people saying on the left that are saying, hey, we just didn't throw enough money at this. I mean, we were on the cusp. It almost worked. Wink, wink. If we could have maybe made it $1.5, $2 trillion, something meaningful, it would have worked.
No, I mean, we certainly don't see eye to eye on that. I mean, the problem is bloated government is the economy's worst enemy, right? And the best thing that we could do is to streamline government, to rein in that progressive state, to streamline the tax system, to make regulations more predictable so that businesses and individuals can invest appropriately. The last thing we need is to pour more money because, look, the government doesn't own any dollars of its own, right? It's taking it out of the private marketplace and investing it where it thinks is best rather than letting individuals and businesses determine how to use those resources.
Steve, the third quarter and fourth quarter GDP, we saw a big move, retracement, if you will, of government spending, particularly in the fourth quarter. And ironically, what we saw also was consumer spending was up and business spending up. Do you think we're getting clear signs that everyone could take a cue that, hey, hey, let's get government out of the way. We're seeing with sequester and everything else, and maybe we will get some traction and a wind in our sails.
Well, remember, government does not produce wealth. The private sector produces wealth. So any dollar you take out of the private sector and run through the government doesn't have the same multiplier effect that it does if you leave it in the economy. So, and the other thing is businesses simply can't plan today. You have all of these short-term tax expenditures that are coming in, going out, and those don't create jobs because businesses need to look over a 10 to 20-year period on these investments, and they have to then plan for their costs. And so when these short-term stimuli come in, they are discounted in the private sector for business investment.
I guess you could say government doesn't create broad wealth because $1 trillion, quite a few cronies made a lot of money over the last few years. That's for sure. Real quick, Sabrina.
Yeah, and let's not forget what's coming down the pike is Obamacare, right? And the CBO has already predicted that another 2 million jobs will be lost by 2017, another 2.5 million over the next decade. So lots of bad news that the president is trying to sort of maybe pivot away from.
Well, you know what? When it's easier not to work, it's hard to lure people off the sidelines. Guys, you both are fantastic. Really appreciate it. Thanks a lot.
Thanks.
Well, you know what? In the spending, it just